think I even have language. I'm way off script. I don't know if I can find it. 1872 was Yellowstone. The law said that the lands were hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale under the laws of the United States, and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit, enjoyment, and enjoyment of all of the people. Regulations shall provide for the preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park, and their retention in their natural condition. So this is a major reversal of federal land policy. For the first time, the federal government draws a line around this place, like they've been drawing square lines all over the place, but this one you can't have. We want this to be accessible to the public. Takes a little while, but in the 1880s, they add a few more national parks. 1890s. I'll pick up that story again. So let me go back to the one about forests that I was telling just a couple of minutes ago. So with this concern about fraud, and the concern that we're going to run out of timber, the term was timber famine that was being bandied about in the 1880s or so, and also a concern about protecting watersheds. Congress in 1891 passed a law that was reforming a bunch of land laws. At the very end of that is a really small section of the law that gives the president the right to reserve from settlement forests. I don't even know if it's 3 sentences long. Very small. And that's the beginning of what we now know as national forests. They were called first forest reserves. Right away, they reserved Yellowstone Forest Reserve outside of Yellowstone National Park. And within a year, how quickly am I going to find this in here? Within a year, the president had created 15 forest reserves amounting to 13 million acres, pulling it out of the public domain so that it couldn't, or pulling it out off the market. You could not own it anymore as an individual.
Which president was that?
It started with Benjamin Harrison, but then all of his successors were adding to it. And Teddy Roosevelt made a big deal, of course, and put a whole bunch into those forest reserves. So we've got a park. We've got the beginning of the forest, or the national forest reserves. But it's a little sketchy. Who's in control? Because there's no park service. So the Army is mostly taking care of the parks that exist. There's no Forest Service yet. And the little part of the act that we call the Forest Reserve Act, it's not really the name of the law, doesn't say what it's for. So in 1897, Congress tries to give a little more description about what these forest reserves are about. They say the purpose of the forest reserves is to improve and protect the forest within the reservation, or for the purpose of securing favorable conditions of water flows, and to furnish a continuous supply of timber for the use and necessities for citizens. So we want to protect it for water and timber. The national forests are for those purposes. Watershed protection is central. I think that's not something we always recognize. In 1905, Congress put all the national forests, which started to be called national forests in 1907, put all the forest reserve in 1905, into the Department of Agriculture. They had been in the Department of Interior. They put it in the Department of Agriculture. And this is more than just a bureaucratic shuffling. It signals something important. Trees are a crop, to be managed like a crop. We can debate whether actually they're forests and they're not a crop, but that was the signal by putting it into the Department of Agriculture. And they put a man in charge by the name of Gifford Pinchot. He's the first chief of the Forest Service. And he did this great thing. He wrote his own instructions for his job, gave it to his boss to sign, and says, this is what he's supposed to do. All land is to be devoted to its most productive use for the permanent good of the whole people and not for the temporary benefit of individuals or companies. You will see to it that the water, wood, and forage of these reserves are conserved and wisely used for the benefit of the home builder first of all, upon whom depends the best permanent use of lands and resources alike. So this is we're not trying to make money here. We're not trying to support large corporations. This is for the home builder. So this is that continuation of that Jeffersonian faith that I sort of started off talking about, just in a little different context in the West, having this public reserve. So now we have a Forest Service, and we have a leader in the conservation movement, like Gifford Pinchot, who wants to put things to wise use to benefit the greatest number of people he could, for the longest time that he could. This is complicated, hard thing to do. And that notion of conserve and wise use increasingly runs into problems because other people have different strategies and ideas in mind, right? So the famous example, that's so famous I always hate talking about it because it's too famous, happens in Yosemite National Park, which is created by this time. And there's a valley with the river running through it, and it's very, very beautiful. And San Francisco would like some water, and think it'd be really great if we put a dam there to store the water for San Franciscans to use. And Gifford Pinchot, believing that we should do the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time, thinks it's a fantastic idea. And then there's this fella in California by the name of John Muir, a starry-eyed guy who likes to spend a lot of time in the mountains alone. Thinks it's a really bad idea because Yosemite's a special place. And we have a national debate in the first 15 years of the 20th century over what to do here. And the dam wins out. But one of the things that results out of that, for lots of reasons I don't want to get into, but one of the results of that was the creation of the National Park Service in 1916. It was seen that we don't have a government bureau that's sort of looking out for these parks that we keep adding here and there. By that time, the glacier existed, Mount Rainier existed, Yosemite and Yellowstone existed. Lots of these parks had, but no managing agency in the federal government to sort of look after its interests. So in 1916, the Park Service gets created, and it gets a difficult mission. Congress directs the Park Service to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So we're going to make this easy so you can enjoy it, but we're not going to do anything that impairs it. So what are we supposed to do? Because a really cool rustic hotel would enhance my enjoyment, but is that unimpaired? And so the Park Service has this tension in it from the beginning. And still now in the 101st year of its existence. So these are the first two federal agencies that are in place. And of course, questions about what to do and how to do it arise pretty quickly. The Forest Service, one of the first things it does is it adds a grazing fee to ranchers who run cattle or sheep on national forests. And ranchers, what do you think they said? Oh, sure. No. They said, you can't do this. This is our customary range. We've been using it forever. You can't charge us. The Supreme Court in 1911 said, yep, we can. But forever, there is a conflict fiercely fought over these grazing fees. Whether they're enough, how to collect them, who pays, all of these sorts of things. 1911, Congress passed something called the Weeks Act, which gave Congress the right or the ability to purchase land in the East. So that is the beginning of federal land reservation in the east part of the country. Now this is important because what had happened up to that point for this emerging public land system was there's all this public domain in the west, no one had claimed it yet, so either Congress in the case of parks or the president in case of forests said, you can't have this. So it wasn't already owned by someone. On the East Coast, that land was already owned by somebody. But in 1911, the Weeks Act gave Congress the right to purchase it. This expands in another act in the 1920s. And moving in that direction, Congress increasingly, under certain circumstances, acquires more and more land in the East Coast. That's why we have national forests in the East Coast too, and national parks. Sometimes, in the case of some parks in the South, it was gifted by the Rockefeller family, for example. Said, we'll buy this, we're going to give it to the government, we'll make a national park out of it. Often in the 1930s, when the economy was not so great, and timber companies were going broke and not paying their taxes, the government acquired their holdings pretty cheaply, and that's how we get some of these public lands in the East. The point I'm trying to make is by the 10s, 20s, and 30s, this public land system is starting to be a national one, not just something that's Western. Boy, I better speed up. I think I can. So it's this point, 1930s or so, I'll use that as the transition point, where these agencies start to intensify their management. So the first phase was sort of building out the bureaucracy and getting the laws in place that allow for these things, the national parks and the national forests. In the middle part of the 20th century, these agencies, I think, flex their muscles and say, we can intensify our management of all sorts of things. For example, even something we don't think is manageable, wilderness. It's the 1930s when the Forest Service first institutes its regulations on wilderness. So what that is, what that means. Part of that means you can't do this here, you can't do that there, drawing lines around certain parts of national forests, saying we're not going to build roads here, we're not going to have timber harvest here. For now, that's what they said then. Forest Service wanted to intensify the management of range of game, or not game, I guess that too, killing off predators, but also for livestock interests. In 1946, the President, Harry Truman, created the Bureau of Land Management by merging something called the General Land Office and the U.S. Grazing Service. Now the General Land Office was the bureaucracy that was in charge of all the homesteading, so if you were going to homestead, you'd apply to the General Land Office. So it had control, if you will, of all of that public domain that hadn't been bought or claimed yet. Grazing Service is trying to regulate grazing on that land, ranching on those lands. Bureau of Land Management comes together in 1946 and tries to deal with a terrible declining rangeland in the American West. The Bureau of Land Management from the beginning is, I don't want to overstate this too much, but completely and totally controlled by ranchers. In fact, there's at one point, I just learned this week as a matter of fact, there's at one point where the ranchers are paying the salary of the BLM. So the people that you're regulating are paying your salary. You think you're going to cut them off? Probably not. Now that situation didn't go on forever. The paying situation didn't go on forever. But it was very difficult early on for the BLM to have any sort of managerial control power. At the time that this is happening, there's also the creation of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a combining of a couple of other previous bureaucracies, and I'm not going to be able to find it in all these pages in front of me. So most of the stuff. And I think it was 1940, but I have to double check that too, and I'm not going to spend the time to do that. And the Fish and Wildlife Service takes over lots of different places in the West. Often, They're acquiring private land too, where there are sellers who are willing to give, willing to sell their land to the federal government. Places like, that were in the news a year ago, do you remember the Mount Here standoff? That was from that sort of era. And what we do in these wildlife refuges, often or not, let's just draw lines around them and make sure that the birds are okay, the ducks. We manage so ducks will come, so we plant certain things we think that they'll like. We allow hunters into our refuges, which is a really good thing, because at some point, not gonna look up to date, Congress passes the law called the Duck Stamp Act, which allows people to buy duck stamps, and the duck stamps, you have money that helps fund the wildlife refuges. But the wildlife refuges, because they essentially produce ducks rather than timber, they produce ducks. They have a constituency, people who want to shoot ducks. And that's a good thing. It's good to have a constituency, it seems to me. But the Fish and Wildlife Service end up intervening quite a bit in the natural environment to make it into to make it produce what they want. These refuges often are part of public-private checkerboard messes. And so you have, like by the 50s, this is a great story, you've got the Fish and Wildlife Service hiring pilots to herd ducks off the private land to make sure they get on the refuge land.